Patrick.
Thank you, Rob. I want to discuss several issues. First, red lines and deadlines. Second, what an attack might look like. And third, what a deal might look like. We have a lot to say in this report about the implications of red lines and deadlines, their problems as well as their advantages. In March 2012, President Obama said, quote, Iran's leaders should understand that I do not have a policy of containment. I have a policy to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, end quote. Now that sounds like a straightforward red line, no nuclear weapon. But it is not, as we discuss. Let me note some problems. First, ambiguity. Iran could imitate its neighbor Pakistan by producing all the parts for a nuclear weapon, indeed for several such weapons, and then almost entirely assembling them. Yet because the last screw had not been tightened, the U.S. government certified to Congress each year that Pakistan did not have a nuclear weapon, a certification influenced by Pakistan's strategic centrality for delivering aid to the Afghan Mujahideen fighting the Soviet invasion. In Iran's case, it is possible that a president would find it so inconvenient to say that Iran had nuclear weapons that he would use a lawyerly subterfuge to evade an unpleasant truth. Second, uncertainty. How would we know if Iran crossed any red line that we established? If we have to wait until Iran tests a nuclear weapon to know, well, it's too late to take preventive action. Short of that, we have to act on the basis of intelligence. And acting on the basis of intelligence is tough. To begin with, the intelligence community is understandably going to be very cautious about stating that it has high confidence that Iran has a nuclear weapon. The intelligence community will search for every possible alternative explanation of whatever it has found, because it will want to avoid sending off yet another president off to war on the basis of wrong information. Then an additional factor is how to persuade the world. If the U.S. government asserts that U.S. intelligence has determined that Iran has crossed a red line, the world is not going to accept the U.S. judgment unless there's clear and convincing evidence, which means that whatever evidence we have, we're going to have to put out there. And the intelligence community is not going to be enthusiastic about revealing its sources and methods. And furthermore, the Iranians may well invite international inspectors to look at whatever U.S. has identified, and that offer would be almost impossible to reject. But there will be tremendous pressure on the international inspectors to issue a tempered report that does not fully back up the U.S. claims. So, a final problem with the idea of this red line that we set down is preoccupation. If we say that we will not act until Iran crosses a red line, that implies, if we say we will act once Iran crosses a red line, that implies that we will not act until Iran reaches that moment. That empowers Iran to decide when to act. And Iran can wait to cross the nuclear threshold at a propitious moment, such as when the world is preoccupied elsewhere, or when Iran's help is needed with some other international problem. Suppose that one day Iran is only a month out from having nuclear weapons, and then there is a huge crisis for the United States in the Middle East, even bigger than the recent wave of demonstrations. The middle of a Middle East crisis is not a good moment for the United States to hit Iran. No matter how much the president may be determined to stop Iran from going nuclear, if he's preoccupied when Iran crosses the threshold, he may have to hold off. Enough on red lines. Let me just say a couple words about deadlines. The risk with a deadline is that Iran will do nothing until the day before the deadline, and then it will propose a seemingly attractive deal, which is actually very problematic. If Iran is loudly proclaiming its willingness to keep on talking, it will be very difficult for the United States to refuse to explore the new Iranian proposal, as empty as it may be. On the other hand, we do have to give some urgency to the talks. President Obama has said that the window for diplomacy is closing. Ambassador Rice yesterday said, quote, time is wasting, end quote. And that should indeed be true. Interminable, unproductive, intermittent talks only help Iran. One suggestion that I'm particularly enamored with, is that instead of talking about red lines or deadlines, we talk about benchmarks that have to be met in order for the diplomatic negotiations to continue. By establishing benchmarks, we can say, we can create a certain urgency by saying that Iran must take a certain set of actions to show that diplomacy is working. And the benchmark model would be based on results, not on a calendar. But we need some way to lend urgency to these talks, and yet neither red lines nor deadlines seem ideally suited for doing that. Let me turn to my second point, what an attack might look like. Earlier this year, Scott Shane of the New York Times quoted me on their front page as saying, quote, "I often get asked when Israel might attack Iran. I say 2 years ago," end quote. And indeed, assassinating Iranian engineers and unleashing computer viruses are not friendly acts. And the United States has been up to its eyeballs in this game. The U.S. has acknowledged sabotaging equipment bound for Iran, facilitating defectors, engaging in intrusive intelligence collection. By the way, I would have loved to have been there when the U.S. note asking for the drone to be handed back to the United States was delivered to the Iranian authorities. That was the more nervy things we've ever done. And furthermore, David Sanger of the New York Times tells a convincing story about Obama being deeply involved in a wide range of cyber attacks in Iran. These covert attacks continue. On September 17th, the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization Director Feridun Abbas Davani said that exactly 1 month earlier, the power lines to the Fordo enrichment site, quote, were cut using explosives, end quote. And he noted, quote, a power outage is a way of damaging centrifuge machines, end quote. If you think that explosion was an accident, please see me afterwards about the bridge I'm selling. Quiet intervention could have great advantages over a large-scale attack, including reducing the likelihood of international censure and Iranian retaliation. Additional covert steps and other unacknowledged military steps, which are now considered too risky, could well be worth considering should the talks falter. However, realistically, it will be a great challenge to identify shadow measures sufficiently robust that the Iranian nuclear program is materially slowed. Although we can hope that such acts would sow doubt in Iranian leaders' minds with regard to their development of nuclear weapons or otherwise induce them to compromise. Certainly, going small is the Israeli way of war. For 50 years now, whenever Israel has gone after another country's unconventional weapons, its method every time has been to go as small and quiet an attack as possible. Whether it was targeting German missile engineers in Egypt in the early 1960s, or striking the Syrian reactor in 2007, as David has written about in The New Yorker, Israel goes as small as it can. I have no idea what that'll mean for Iran, but I strongly suspect Israel will try once again to go small. Finally, my last point, what would a deal look like? The United States has long been cagey about what kind of a nuclear deal it could accept. Some caginess is to be expected in any negotiations. Who lays on the table all of one's cards? And the past Iranian approach certainly does not encourage the U.S. to test the water by making offers. Iran has repeatedly demanded some modest step, which, when the U.S. finally provided, the Iranians promptly pocketed and did nothing in response. And on other occasions, Iran has demanded some U.S. preliminary action, which, when the U.S. complied, Iran ignored and belittled. For instance, Iran demanded for years that the United States agree to direct bilateral negotiations with the Iranians. Once Obama endorsed the idea, embraced the idea, Iran backed off. However, at some point, it may be in our interest to put forward some kind of a final offer. At that point, a central issue in the deal is going to be enrichment. That said, the intensive focus on centrifuges in a potential agreement has prompted the neglect of other important issues, such as compliance, uranium stocks, the sites, and reprocessing. Should these latter issues receive inadequate attention, then even excellent provisions on enrichment would make a deal counterproductive. Now, getting to zero centrifuges is going to be tough. Ayatollah Khamenei seems so dug in on the issue that he reportedly has said that he, quote, would resign if for any reason Iran is deprived of its right to enrichment, end quote. Furthermore, complete and permanent cessation of enrichment has not been the position of the international community. The Security Council resolutions only call for suspension until Iran has restored confidence in the exclusively peaceful purpose of its nuclear program. Nor has any of the P5+1 members publicly called for complete and permanent cessation, much as that may be their preference. Indeed, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has said that the United States would not object to Iran resuming enrichment under some circumstances. Given the obstacles that the negotiators will likely face in pressing for zero enrichment, they might consider an old trick for reviving hung-up talks, namely, change the question. And in changing the question, they should remember that the ultimate goal of negotiations is to push Iran further away from a nuclear weapons capability. And reducing enrichment is a means to that end. Now, the 2010 Tehran research reactor deal was aborted, but it put forward an interesting idea, namely limiting the amount of enriched uranium in Iran. If Iran were to agree to ship out of the country any enriched uranium as soon as it was made, and to only get that enriched uranium back in the form of fuel rods and fuel plates, which are hard to make into nuclear weapons, that's a step which could arguably address Western objectives almost as well as if Iran destroyed its present centrifuges. This could be the basis for a deal. Not an ideal deal, but the basis for a deal. And in fact, I would argue the parameters of such a deal are becoming clear. An Iranian once influential in the nuclear portfolio has been giving talks around town outlining a nuclear deal. Since those talks were off the record, I cannot spell out the details of what Syed Hussein Mousavian describes. But I'll just simply say that his proposal is not really that far from what we lay out in this report. The essential point I'm making is that the P5+1 may find a way that Tehran can get its publicly acknowledged goal, which is to keep enriching, while at the same time achieving the P5+1's objective of keeping Iran far from nuclear breakout capability. However, I want to warn you that just because the parameters of a deal are becoming clear does not mean the deal can be made. It has long been said about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that the parameters of a deal are well known. But neither side is happy with what they would have to do to get the deal. We may get to that unfortunate situation with regard to the Iranian nuclear program. But first, we have to make sure that two sides understand that there may be a deal to be had. Perhaps Tehran does not see that. Certainly Washington is not sure that there could be a deal. The two sides may not know if there's a deal to be had, but they should know how to find out. The way to do that is to have trusted senior officials from each side meet for a candid conversation. That role is generally reserved for spies. Part of their job is talking to bad people, and so there are fewer negative repercussions if news of the meeting leaks out. And there are obvious candidates on each side, David Petraeus and Qasem Soleimani. A meeting between those two would, to my mind, be much more important than another P5+1 session with Iran. And with that, I commend our report to you. David.
Yeah. Thank you. Very good. Go ahead. Sorry, I'll follow you.
Look, one of the things which we say in the report is that one of the problems of putting down the kind of offer that Dennis made, and we say that there are circumstances under which it's a good idea, but one of the problems of putting down that kind of offer is that when you put down that kind of offer, you are saying that if Iran does not accept this, then something dramatic is going to happen. And that's going to make it harder for us to get an agreement in the P5+1 what the offer should be. And so I actually think that the P5+1 could relatively readily agree on what the terms of that offer should be. The problem is that if we put forward that offer, then we're saying to the Iranian that if Iran doesn't accept it, well, guess what happens next? And that's going to be the problem. Another problem, by the way, putting down an offer like that, is that once you put down an offer like that, you've created a clear benchmark against which all further negotiations can be judged. You know, it's like the problem I have with the Iranians when they release their PowerPoint about the negotiating stances. Once the Iranians released that PowerPoint of what they had said, P5+1, every Iranian negotiator in future negotiations is going to be judged against how did he do compared to what the Iranians had said at that point. And so once we establish what we say is our this is our final offer, well, guess what, guys? We're going to have to budge from our final offer in order to get agreement. That's going to be natural. And there's going to be a torrent of criticism that the Iranian negotiator will be criticized if he can't get a better deal in that final offer. The American negotiator will be criticized if he gives up anything it's not in that offer. So putting forward a final offer could be a formula for deadlock. But let's be blunt. If it looks like the negotiations are going nowhere, then I'm in favor of putting forward a final offer. Even though I don't think that that's likely to mean that we're going to get an agreement, but because I think that that's going to clarify why we're going to war. And I think that putting forward a final offer is clarifying why we're going to war. I don't think it's a way to help us get an agreement.
It just shows that we don't all have agreement up here, which is fine.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask for questions. Walt Slocum on the center left there.
If what the Iranians wanted was a civil nuclear program, they could have had it years ago and we'd probably be paying for it. They might be induced to want to settle for just a civil nuclear program. And what do you think are the incentives that the Iranians will have? Partly on the downside, they will lose the war. It may be a grim war, but in the long run, if we want to, they'll lose it. Or are there incentives which are not arguing about how many centrifuges can dance on the head of a pin that will induce them to take what it's hard to believe is what they really want?
The final offer would give Iran everything it said it's won. So we're not asking them to give up which they've announced as their goal. And that's a useful thing, both with the Iranian public and with the world public. We have to face the distinct possibility that our campaign of greater pressure on Iran will not influence the Supreme Leader. I mean, the Supreme Leader has good reason to believe that North Korea is a success and China is a failure, because North Korea has sustained its revolutionary fervor through several generations of leadership, whereas the Chinese regime, while it's still in place, has lost its revolutionary fervor. Now, if that's the criteria by which he judges what constitutes success, the fact that North Koreans are starving and the Chinese are prosperous is not as important. And if that's the situation we face, we should find that out soon. Because in that situation, we are headed towards war. And we need to clarify that. I'm not sure that the Iranian leadership would agree with that judgment. I'm not even sure the Supreme Leader would make that judgment. But it is quite possible that he will. And if he does, we should know that soon.
I'm going to repeat the admonition from the beginning that it's important to be humble. We don't know.
Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council and allmonitor.com. And then also, you don't say it, but you suggest consequences if the Iranians don't buy this. By that, do you mean going to war? Because there was a recent poll, I think by Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs that said 70% of Americans do not want to go to a war with Iran, even if it develops nuclear weapons. So, where's your ultimatum here? Thanks.
But the point is that, and this is the answer to the second part of your question. Once you make prevention your objective, if diplomacy fails, it doesn't leave you a whole lot of choice other than the use of force. Well, you could redefine your objective, but I don't believe this president, if this president is reelected, there was a debate within the administration over prevention versus containment. This is a president who doesn't make impulsive decisions. And he made a decision after that was debated. It was thought through, it was thought out. It was, in his mind, he made a decision. And I believe that I take his decisions very seriously because I watched him in action in the national security area. So that objective, it seems to me, puts us in a certain place. And, I think I would say there's no doubt in my mind that he would like a peaceful resolution to this if it's at all possible. There's no doubt in my mind that he will want to give diplomacy every chance. But I also think that if he feels that he's exhausted diplomacy, that he's prepared to use force, even if that's not his preference.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. Look, the sanctions are starting to bite on Iran's economy. And we are going to learn before too long how much priority the Supreme Leader places on that. And it is distinctly possible that he would be prepared to see Iran become North Korea. That may be a desirable model for him. I don't think it's a desirable model for the Iranian people at all. I don't think that's what they want. And I think he'd face a lot of resistance if he tried to push that idea through. But that is possible. I mean, this is a man who seems to place such high priority on revolutionary fervor. And we will find that out. I don't know. But I would just like to suggest that one can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that. But I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition of, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.